Welcome everybody to today's panel. The focus is on decarbonizing the tough stuff, cement, steel, chemicals. We have great panelists today who are going to talk us through some of the opportunities and challenges related to decarbonizing these heavy industries. Canary Media has been spending a special week focusing on these topics, trying to dive in, but also realizing we're just scratching the surface when it comes to covering these issues. So joining us today, Dr. Vanessa Chan is the Chief Commercialization Officer for the Department of Energy and Director of DOE's Office of Technology Transitions. Chathurika Gamage is a Principal in the Climate Aligned Industries Program at RMI. Hilary Lewis is a Steel Director at Industrious Labs. And we have another panelist, Selene Law, a Senior Associate and Energy and Power Lead at Clean Tech Group, who is also suffering technical difficulties this morning. So let's start with some of the challenges. Chadu, can you talk us through some of the sort of the high-level issues around decarbonizing iron and steel and what makes that sector particularly difficult in terms of reducing emissions?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and great to be on today. When we think about iron and steel decarbonization and the challenges that you spoke of, we've try and focus on a particular type of steel, and that's ore-based steel or primary-based steel, as we like to call it. And a lot of the emissions, when we look at that supply chain, come from actually obtaining the iron content from the iron ore. And so if we think about how do we decarbonize, it's really around curbing that footprint and not creating CO2 as a byproduct while we get that iron. Or we could look towards demand-side measures. And then the challenges around the supply of that ore-based steelmaking is incredibly difficult, just because if we look at the assets and the structure that it's needed, 70% of the world's steel is produced this way. And we refer to that as incumbent steelmaking, where the iron and steel is made on the same facility. These assets are enormous. They hire and have skilled labor forces of thousands of people, and the assets themselves are, long operating lifetimes. They're there for multi-decade timeframes. And so when we think about doing a big transition, it takes many years to plan it. And so there's the site conditions that are challenging, but then there is the, holistic transition challenges, and we usually bucket them in sort of 4 key themes. First one being cost. These are sort of billion-dollar assets that require capital, and then the money to raise that capital as well is proving to be challenging, as well as technology readiness. And we see that a lot more for commercial and viability for these technologies as well, something that investment and financiers are looking for, and we need to sort of see that go up in terms of the ranking scales. The second and third point are more around the regional, demand for this type of asset or facility. So when we think about political motives or regional communities, are they accepting, and do they know, the opportunities as well as maybe the impacts, both financial and social, that come from these transitions as well. And then lastly, and certainly not least, when we think about something like green hydrogen for steel making, a lot of the enabling environment and infrastructure that's needed. When we think about electrolyzers, we need a lot of it. And then to power those electrolyzers to be green, needs a lot of electricity. And so upgrades to the grid, storage, and all of the renewable development that comes with that are massive and at gigawatt scale.
Great, thank you for that. And I know that there's a lot of overlap, or to some extent, between all 3 of these industries in terms of the technology and the challenges. And Vanessa, could you talk a bit about sort of the big picture challenges for cement and then the chemical manufacturing as well?
Sure, happy to. So one thing I wanted to do before I dived into that was to just share with you that last month my team released some deep dive reports on low carbon cement and chemicals that begins to look at this conversation. And it's part of our series of Pathways to Commercial Liftoff reports, where we spent the last few years engaged in conversation with industry and experts on what it will take for key energy and decarbonization technologies to reach commercial liftoff. So we've covered things like advanced nuclear, clean hydrogen, and many others. And so if you guys go to liftoff.energy.gov, that's liftoff.energy.gov, you can find these reports where we are really trying hard to codify what are the challenges that are preventing these to lift off at commercial scale. So our new cement report and our chemicals report takes a clear look at the challenges in these sectors and outlines the roadmap that we have to follow to actually attack these challenges. And the first challenge is just the sheer scale. These are massive industries, and cement production alone drives 7% of global emissions and 1% of the US emissions. So moving these industries is like turning a giant ocean tanker, and we have to make big moves quickly in ways that both meet our energy and climate goals, but also work best for these industries, their organizations, and even more importantly, the communities that they live in. So some of the reasons often cited for slow progress on the decarbonization of industrial emissions include the immaturity and high cost of many decarbonization levers, unidentified or uncertain customer demand for low carbon products, and in some but not all sectors, reluctance among companies to be a first mover. I often hear, I'm happy to be first in line to be the fourth mover, but no one wants to be first in line to be the first mover. So to take the cement sector as an example, the market right now is challenged by the lack of uniform standards to define low carbon materials and enable informed procurement. And the sector has a 10 to 20 year adoption cycle for new blends of materials, both from the long lead time needed to update standards and a long customer adoption cycle. And so new decarbonization approaches may come with structural cost increases for their operations. And if we do want to implement some of these solutions, such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, they may have to build support from local communities and address environmental and safety concerns. So all these are real challenges, but solvable challenges through our investments, policy improvements, and technology commercialization efforts. But I want to, address that it's not just low technology readiness levels that we need to also address. We also need to look at the market adoption challenges as well.
Great, thank you. And diving into some of the potential solutions or the solutions that maybe seem closer at hand for the steel industry, Hilary, could you kind of walk us through what you're seeing in terms of sort of the most promising pathways for producing green steel, and maybe even define what green steel means for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Chats, for setting up some great context here. I think to start with what I'm not going to talk about, and Chats mentioned this. There are two types of steel. There's primary steel made from iron ore, and there's recycled steel made from scrap. And actually, some good news here in the US is actually that we're a global leader in recycling steel. We have a great supply chain to get old cars and washing machines back and turn them into new products. And that is excellent. We should keep doing that. And globally, we need to maximize that resource. And the technology that does that process is run off grid electricity or dedicated renewables. So there's a clean alternative for recycling, which, as I said, is important to keep using. But the big problem in steel is the emissions from primary steel, which is steel made from iron ore. And we do have some technologies available or nearly available today that can get rid of most of those emissions. So there's a technology called direct reduced iron. And in the process of making steel, to get iron, the big problem that you have to solve is getting the oxygen out of the iron ore. And so today that's done in blast furnaces that use coke made from coal, and the carbon bonds with the oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. And in a direct reduced iron furnace, you're using methane gas today, but you can replace that methane gas with hydrogen. Renewable energy powered hydrogen or green hydrogen can make this process nearly emissions free and fossil fuel free. And so that's when I think about green steel, that's what I'm thinking about, is when there's a direct reduced iron process that uses green hydrogen made from renewable energy. And this, there isn't an existing facility today that's built and operational at a commercial or industrial scale, but they are under construction and the pilots have been run. And so, the real leader here is in Sweden. We're seeing a lot of plants are under construction. And we do have some direct reduced iron plants that run on methane gas today that can be converted to green hydrogen and then be producing green steel. I did also want to mention that there's some other exciting developments in the pipeline, not quite as advanced commercially, but molten oxide electrolysis, which you've written about, Maria. There's a company out of Boston called Boston Metal that they're advancing this technology, and that would take green hydrogen out of the equation, which makes a lot of people's lives a lot simpler. So I think that would be a very exciting advancement, but it's a little bit farther behind in the technology readiness process.
Great. Yeah. And my colleague, Jeff St. John, actually just wrote a piece about electrowinning, which is kind of also in sort of this next generation steel technology phase. Also, the goal would be to kind of eliminate hydrogen and energy intensity from the process. And just to note that I'm still having technical delay, so I apologize if I'm asking questions that you've already answered, or if the conversation's not flowing as smoothly as we'd like. And it looks like Selene is not with us, so or can't hear us.
I'm here, so
You're here. Okay, great.
yeah.
Well, I was going to ask if you could talk about thermal energy storage and the role that could play in reducing fossil fuel use for these high heat industrial processes, and also sort of the wave of development or startup investment that you're seeing from Clean Tech Group's perspective.
Yeah, sure. And first of all, my apologies for technical delays. This is what happens when your laptop is is a bit older, but there you go. So yeah, so we're actually seeing quite a lot happening in this space. So you're absolutely correct in that thermal energy storage is a potential solution for steel and cement decarbonization. And not only could they help with the decarbonization, but they could also help yield potential cost savings, as these systems typically charge up when the cost of electricity is low. So how do they work? So thermal energy storage system usually work on the basis of charging up with renewable electricity, which heats up material with good heat storage properties, so such as graphite or refractory brick, and they can reach temperatures of 1,500. There's even some pilots for well over 2,000 degrees. And with installations, these systems can retain heat for days and even for months. So in steel sector in particular, these systems can be used for load shifting, firing furnaces, melting furnaces, and replacing fossil fuels in various processes. From what they could be used for both EAF as well as BOF processes. So some interesting innovators to note here are German company Kraftblock, and they use proprietary upcycled materials as a storage materials. They provide heat up to 1,300 degrees. So what makes them also interesting is the fact that they use waste heat. Both cement and steel industries, about roughly kind of 50% of that high, up to 50% of that high heat is just wasted. So that's what Kraftblock does in many of its applications. It takes waste heat and to kind of supplement it to get to higher temperatures. And is currently working on a pilot project in Saarland in Germany to test flare gas from the steel industry and the use of kind of waste use of heat there. But also we're seeing, bigger companies like Siemens getting into the kind of waste heat space. Two other companies in this space that are quite interesting are Rondo Energy. They use refractory bricks, which have been used in steel industry for years, and also Antora Energy, and they are using graphite for storing energy. So for cement sector, there's an interesting collaboration between solar developers Synhalion and Cemex. So they are working together to produce world's first solar-powered clinker. So Synhalion's solar receivers can achieve temperatures of up to 1,500 degrees. So there is plenty kind of happening in this space. A lot of this still quite early stages, but watch this space for sure.
Mm-hmm. And Vanessa, I wanted to ask you about the chemical industry is obviously a very sort of diverse and fragmented sector, especially compared to the other two. But what are some of the common technology solutions that you're seeing for decarbonizing chemical manufacturing, and which ones maybe are closer at hand and which ones are kind of farther along the horizon?
Yeah, so a few weeks ago, I had the chance to meet a group of senior leaders in the chemicals refining space, and we spent a few hours listening to their feedback about our liftoff reports and hearing about the challenges and opportunities that they see for themselves. as they embark on this decarbonization transition. And as you noted, although that the sector is very diverse, but although that is the case, chemicals and refining production are actually surprisingly interconnected, and they share many of the linked production pathways and opportunities to decarbonization. So for example, fossil fuels are used as a feedstock across both sectors, with refined oil products used for heating and many chemical processes. And the markets are also interlinked, with many global companies producing both refined oil and chemical products. So in the near term today, through the mid-2030s, our liftoff report actually outlines how 20% of production emission reductions could be achieved by the application of a suite of measures that are economic now, like it pencils in economically without any further government support. And these include energy and operational efficiencies, electrification with clean power, clean hydrogen, carbon management on concentrated streams, and the use of other fuels and feedstocks. So these 5 levers offer the most immediate path to emissions reduction with the least disruption to existing operations. And so I think this is really important because it means that these measures can take place within the existing footprint of a facility and could offer at least a 10% internal rate of return in the current policy environment, which is really important to note. And in addition, about 15% of the production emissions in 2030 could be abated through grid decarbonization and demand reduction measures, which I think will take a little more time. But the 5 levers I mentioned earlier actually are here and now. And going further towards 2050, we're looking at alternative value chains in the demonstration pilot phases, such as new bio-based pathways for low and net zero carbon fuels and chemicals, as well as industrial electrification, combined heat and power, and modular nuclear solutions that are still in the R&D pilot stages. So I know we've all got very ambitious goals for a carbon pollution-free power sector in just 12 years, and net zero emissions economy in just 27 years. But the fact that the U.S. chemicals production, oil refining contributes 8% to GDP means that we really need to figure out ways that we are able to help with their footprint. And so really, I'm excited about the work that we can do to try to drive down the 11% of the energy-related carbon dioxide emissions coming from the sector. And just to frame that for you, it's the equivalent to 1.5 times of the total emissions of New York State, or 1/3 of all the annual emissions from U.S. transportation. And but I do think that we've got near-term things as well as longer-term things that will help us get to the goals. But it's really important that we work together in order to drive towards that.
And continuing on that, I'm curious if you could talk more specifically about the role of carbon, so-called carbon management technologies like carbon capture and storage, perhaps direct air capture, how those could fit into these heavy industries, and why a company might want to use it versus another clean energy solution.
Yep, happy to. So we also have a carbon management liftoff report to examine these issues. So go to liftoff.energy.gov to find them. And what we found is that carbon capture and carbon removal have the potential to eliminate hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 per year. And it's important because heavy industries generate a lot of CO2 during their processes. And the levers that we can pull to do that are energy efficiency, industrial electrification, low carbon fuels, feedstocks, and so forth. But those can only get us so far. And that is when we have to add CCUS to the mix, because these other levers will only get us so far in terms of the decarbonization. So currently our modeling suggests that reaching the US to energy transition goals requires us to capture and store 400 to 1,800 million tons of carbon dioxide annually by 2050 through both point source carbon capture, utilization and storage, or CCUS, and carbon dioxide removal, CDR. Many people don't know this. Fun fact, which you can use at a cocktail hour, is that America leads the world in carbon management with more than 20 million tons per year of capture capacity. But that is only 1 to 5% of what we would need by 2050. And so we basically see carbon management growing along 2 different pathways in the near term and the longer term. In the near term, through 2030, we're looking at projects in industries with high purity CO2 streams like ethanol, natural gas processing, and hydrogen. So ways in which we are able to replace the greenhouse challenges in those high purity streams. And those have the best project economics right now. For the longer term, post 2030, we're looking at opportunities in industries with lower purity CO2 streams and distributed process emissions. And that is why we're really starting to look at carbon management opportunities in cement production, steel, through basic oxygen furnace processes, fluidized catalytic crackers in refineries, and flue gas and ammonia. And so nothing is certain, and our liftoff report looks at the real but solvable key challenges facing widespread carbon management deployment. And we're going to need more demonstration projects to really drive the cost curves down. In the end, in order to get there, we have to drive the cost down on these technologies as they're deployed. And one thing I do want to note is we are right now in a once-in-a-generation opportunity, given the current policy and market environment. The 45Q tax credit, which is part of the Inflation Reduction Act, is the largest incentive for carbon management today on Earth. And it provides certainty and attractive project economics for several types of projects. The bipartisan infrastructure law, on the other hand, provides $12 billion in funding for high potential projects across the carbon management value chain, which includes $8 billion for the regional clean hydrogen hubs, one of which must prioritize projects that use CCUS to generate clean hydrogen. And also, Bill has $500 million for industrial emission demonstration projects that include carbon management technologies. And I'm really excited about these because they're catalyzing the private sector to not wait and to really ensure that they are starting to think about deploying their capital so we can start driving those cost curves down.
Great, thank you. Well, and I was gonna, I'm interested to ask chat to you about the sort of these incentives, these federal incentives, other programs with regard to green hydrogen production, and how you think those could help kind of shape the economic case or make more of a case for hydrogen-based green steel making in particular. Could you talk a bit about sort of what you're seeing in your research?
Yeah, sure. And I think echoing a lot of what Vanessa said on essentially project economics and what we need to pencil those projects out. So in all the letters and alphabetizing between IRA and the US, this is kind of a monumental stage in terms of policy and the billions of dollars that's in place. So the hydrogen production tax credit, so 45B, being the primary one. And then there's also 45Y for renewable electricity, which sort of can pair up with that. So when we think about the production tax credit for hydrogen, it's a tiered-based system with a maximum of $3 that you can get per kilogram for the most, I guess, low emissions footprint production pathway for hydrogen. So that would be sort of a green hydrogen, renewable electricity-based hydrogen, and then it sort of tiers down from there. And so when we think about putting that on a levelized cost basis for steel, compared to, let's say, a hydrogen-based plant or natural gas sort of derived DRI, or even a blast furnace with CCS, so thinking about that, or a relined blast furnace, it's sort of in the ballpark, right? It doesn't get us all the way there, but you're in the margins of what could be competitive. And so we might need to see, I guess, other levers that we can talk about to sort of close that gap. But it's drastically reduced what that competitiveness was. Before it was, let's say, $200 a ton. Now that's becoming quite less, right? It's less than $50. And obviously it depends on the competitiveness of natural gas and coal and all of these other things in place, but it's done a lot to close that gap. And so the analysis is essentially saying we need to be seeing hydrogen at around, $1 a kilogram to be competitive with natural gas in the US today. And that's just because of, I guess, the pricing and volatility of natural gas and, taking that into account. And folks also mentioned on the call about DOE's hydrogen hubs as well. I mean, they got announced a couple of weeks ago, and it's a mix between production pathways for a lot of those. But thinking about the billions of dollars that are going in and the infrastructure that's also going to be in place that develops, we have to think a little bit more long-term in terms of what that scaling means and the attention of those hubs. So the more these technologies scale, the further along we travel along the existing learning curve for things like electrolyzers. And so by 2030, for example, hopefully we'll enjoy, cost competitive renewables and seeing hydrogen at less than $1 a kilogram, which is what we need. So it's within eyesight, essentially.
Thank you for that. And again, apologies for the lag on my end. But I was going to ask, Hilary, if you wouldn't mind kind of following up and sharing your perspective or Industrious Labs perspective on the hydrogen programs and kind of where there could be risks that the sort of the hydrogen economy falls short of its climate goals?
Thanks for that question, Maria. Yeah, I think some important context here is that the remaining integrated steel mills in the U.S. are disproportionately in low income and communities of color. And so I think that's like an important backdrop to be having this conversation against when we're thinking about solutions. We need to make sure that when we're building our clean energy or our clean industry future, we're not repeating the harms of the past. We need to be thinking about solutions that work with communities, that promote health, that promote healthy economies, and also that address climate change. So with that in mind, when we looked at the hydrogen hub proposals that have been announced, one of the big concerns that we're hearing from community groups, particularly those in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of fracking happening, is that there's a big concern about the reliance on methane gas. So when we talk about the rainbow of hydrogen, we have green, which is made from renewable energy. We have pink from nuclear, blue, which is natural gas and carbon capture. And that's really where a lot of the concern is. And when we're looking at the hydrogen hub proposals today, and this of course can change as they continue with negotiations, a lot of the gas is centered in the same areas where steel is currently produced. And it's important to think about where steel is produced today, because that's also where our trained workforce is. And we have strong labor unions there that are excellent at what they do, and will be needed. Their expertise will be needed to transition to a clean steel future. So getting it lined up right, where we have access to green hydrogen and access to a trained labor force, is really important in kind of putting all the pieces together to make green steel. The other thing that I'd want to address, just in terms of like why methane gas is a problem in addition to fracking. So when you think about the supply chain of methane, fracking also releases emissions. And so that climate harming pollution isn't being addressed by the carbon capture at a hydrogen plant, for example. There are also concerns about pipelines and pipelines leaking. And then once you get to the carbon capture piece at the hydrogen plant, I think carbon capture is still a big question in many communities' perspective. We've not seen it work perfectly. We haven't seen it work at the levels that are needed to really even address the climate issues. And so there's some concern, I think some valid concern still out there about, is carbon capture even going to address the climate emissions? And then climate emissions aside, we're talking about the communities who live around these facilities. And there's still health harming air pollution that comes from this process. And so addressing health harming air pollution is another big concern and priority for these communities. That's something we really heard yesterday on the Department of Energy webinar for the proposed hydrogen hub in the Pennsylvania and Ohio region. So I think those are some of the concerns, but I think the important context here is just thinking about where these facilities are and the history of harm and making sure we're not repeating those mistakes.
Thanks for that, Hilary. And kind of looking a bit beyond the U.S., kind of at the hydrogen market more globally, Selene, I know the Cleantech Group is tracking quarterly investments in the hydrogen market, and I was curious, could you talk a bit about sort of the trends that you're seeing and what they say about how investors are thinking sort of near term and long term about green hydrogen?
Yeah, happy to. So basically, overall, high interest rate environments and kind of a lot of geopolitical uncertainty has really hampered investment in clean tech across the board, and energy and power sector is no exception. So there's been an overall kind of marked decline in E&P clean tech investments compared to the peak of 2022. And I'm sure everyone's heard a lot about the struggles of the first of the kind investments and the valley of death, which basically the inability of the startups to kind of find funding to scale up its operations beyond a pilot. And that's quite crucial for hydrogen systems because they tend to be quite capex heavy, especially green hydrogen. We're talking about kind of gigafactories and big manufacturing. So overall investments into US hydrogen space were down about 20% year on year, as compared to 2022. But having said that, we've seen a decline in early stage investments, but actually we've seen quite a marked uptick in late stage investments into hydrogen production. So, in fact, late-stage hydrogen investments have increased from 750 million to over 1 billion already, and bearing in mind that that's just the 3 quarters of 2022. However, caveat here, we're only tracking kind of venture investments, so none of the big kind of hydrogen developers come into this picture. Established hydrogen developers, and that really shows that the IRA is working, as hydrogen producers are keen to lock in that tax credit, even though there is still uncertainty around the kind of temporal matching and additionality. And also what I'm hearing is that, compared to Europe, actually investors quite like the IRA tax credit system, and it helps to kind of make systems, make hydrogen more bankable. Say, compared to Europe, where potentially getting grants and getting funding, the process is much more convoluted.
Great. I think that, well, I'm not here. I'm so sorry for the glitches that we're having today, but I think, Selene, that you were finished speaking.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, I didn't get to mention at the beginning, but in about 10 minutes or so, we'll open this up to an audience Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to leave those in the chat, and we'll get to some of those soon. Before then, Vanessa, I just wanted to ask, is there anything else that you would want to add to kind of wrap up our discussion on hydrogen production kind of as it relates to industrial decarbonization?
Yeah, sure. So I think my fellow panelists has covered this quite a bit, which is all these things are kind of interlinked, and hydrogen does play a role here. I think the one thing I definitely wanted to highlight is what we're trying to do here at the DOE is activate the private sector, because in the end, what we need to do is that ensure the private sector is taking on and rolling these technologies out, because in the end, the work that has to be done needs to be private sector led and ideally government enabled. And so someone had mentioned the hydrogen hubs, which was $7 billion was deployed from the bipartisan infrastructure law in order to create these slew of hubs. That was in that announcement, what was found was that $40 billion of private investment has been activated to support the $7 billion invested by the government. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, is to catalyze that private sector work to ensure that we actually are able to bring that private sector dollars to bear. The other side of it, we also recognize that when we are creating the hubs, there's the demand side of it. So how do we ensure the demand is happening? And oftentimes in technology commercialization, what you find is a chicken and egg problem, where the supply doesn't want to build itself out until it knows that there's demand. The demand doesn't want to do offtake agreements until it knows it has a stable supply chain. So everyone looks at each other and they're playing chicken. So part of what we're trying to do to activate that is, there's a notice of intent was released around $1 billion from the bill funding is actually going to be used to help support the demand side activation. And we are working on how to do that, because the chicken and egg has to be solved. The supply and demand match has to be solved. And so I think ultimately what we want to understand is how can we get the private sector activated, because hydrogen plays such an important role, not just industrial decarbonization, but also in things like long duration energy storage, because you can create hydrogen, it can become a chemical storage mechanism. And the earlier and sooner that we start getting ground broken on these hubs and the work being done is when you start to see the cost curves go down. So this kind of chicken and egg impasse really hurts the industry. And for those of you who may have applied to a hydrogen hub and not gotten funding, I think it's a win for everybody, which is we are now going to get things activated, because once we get the cost curve going, then others can jump on and ride that cost curve down. So I think that's really the point I want to make about hydrogen is, like, we need to start moving quickly on these things if we're really going to be able to see movement going on to hit the goals that we have.
Thanks. And I wanted to follow up kind of more generally from a technology commercialization standpoint, not just hydrogen, but a lot of these cutting edge technologies for reducing industrial emissions, how do you see the DOE's role in, as you've said before, leveraging billions of public dollars to catalyze trillions of private dollars? Could you talk more a bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think ultimately what we're trying to do is understand what are the risks around bringing these technologies to market, because in the end, the private sector needs to see how they have a sustainable business economic model, which is why the economics matter so much. And one of the things that I oftentimes concerned with is when people talk about TRLs only, because I think scientists and engineers can solve any technology issue, but there can be technologies that work, but the cost is so high that you actually can't bring these to market. And so a lot of what we've been doing here is trying to expand beyond technology readiness levels. We actually created something called adoption readiness levels, which you can find on OTT's website, which is around the other dimensions beside technology that we need to worry about if we're able to bring these things to market. So other panelists have mentioned cost. That's one of the dimensions that we are highlighting needs to be figured out. Things like workforce, permitting and siting, supply chain, all those are things which oftentimes we don't think about when we have new technologies that we're trying to understand. So the work that we're doing here at DOE through the adoption readiness levels, as well as through the liftoff reports, is to bring everyone on the same page of what is it going to take, not just from getting the technology to work, but also to drive widespread adoption, and making sure that as an ecosystem, we're working together to address those. And I think the Bill and IRA dollars is a great catalyst for that. But in the end, some of the things don't have to do with money, like siting and permitting. So what do we do as a collective ecosystem to get us there? This is a really, really hard problem, but it's exciting because I think we just need to start moving on this. And anyone who does commercialization know it's not perfect. I know, Hilary, you mentioned a lot of the challenges that we have, and it's true for non-new technologies, but I am very confident in the U.S. ingenuity, both on the private and public sector side, to figure some of these things out. Like in the case of hydrogen, there's a private pipeline right now that actually does transport hydrogen across multiple states. And so there's ways that we can do this, and we just have to figure out how to do it. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is drive a private sector-led, government-enabled energy transition.
Great. And kind of thinking more about the market side, we've been talking a lot about technology innovation and creating supply chains. Chatu, could you talk more about how you see efforts to develop, to kind of create more demand, or I guess gather all of this demand from the companies that use steel and chemicals and concrete, and you maybe could talk a bit about some of RMI's initiatives around this as well.
Yeah, happy to. And I think, well, Vanessa sort of hit it on the head of how much of a powerful lever demand can be in this. And so when we think about decarbonizing technologies and what the investment case is needed, then we can think about customers, right? Twofold: asking for a better product in the sense now of a lower emissions footprint, but it could be sort of any differentiated product in itself, and their willingness to pay more for this product in the near term. And so this premium, we're finding, can accelerate the investment decision for a steel maker, but it could be the same, right, for across heavy industries. And RMI has done this sort of work before, particularly in sustainable aviation fuels, thinking about how do you aggregate these people and customer base that is willing, right, in the near term to pay for that and drive that investment case. So private sector demand commitments, we certainly see in estimates and coming through from IRA aggregation as well, around 6 million tons of green steel that will be required by 2030 from top sort of 40 companies to against their commitments that they've already made, their sustainability goals. And so that's the equivalent of around 2 to 3 steel plants already by 2030. And how they get there and that procurement method is something that they're looking at in real time, right? So now they've made those commitments. How can they deliver on these commitments? Groups such as First Movers Coalition and Steel Zero have done a fantastic job in getting these commitments from these heavy industry purchasers and buyers. The work now is to essentially transfer these commitments into offtake to make sure that this investment happens for these technologies. And particularly for the steel sector, RMI recently launched our steel purchasing and buyers platform at New York Climate Week. And this is essentially what we're trying to do in a region, if North America first, just because of the policy incentives that are there in place, to say, how can we get a group of buyers, very ambitious buyers, to make a signal to the market?
I'm sorry, I can't tell. I believe you were finished speaking again. Apologies for the technical difficulties. But one thing I was going to ask Hilary about is Hilary and I actually I joined Industrious Labs and some.
Oh no.
No.
Sort of this need to create green steel. So Hilary, could you elaborate more on sort of the role that you see automakers playing in the green steel transition, especially sort of how it ties into their efforts to electrify their vehicles as well?
Yes, but Chaz, do you want to finish that thought real fast? I know.
Oh, thanks, Hilary. Yeah, that's fine. I think we're just in the glitch phase still, but no, essentially to say, how can we turn this procurement process more viable? So there is an RFP process that we're running. Details available on the RMI website on the purchasing platform. The whole idea is to see and identify what this green premium could be and who could be willing to supply this green steel to these buyers. But thanks, Larry. Over to you on the auto question.
Yeah. So looking at the auto sector, it's a really important market for primary steel, particularly in North America. So when we're looking at primary steel, there are currently two companies that make steel in blast furnaces that use coke from coal. That's Cleveland-Cliffs and US Steel. And for each of them, the automotive market represents about a third of their sales. And so there's a big market opportunity here if automakers are to demand a green steel product. And Vanessa, I totally agree about this finger pointing issue. I have a lot of proof points here to show why I think that automakers are saying that they want green steel. But I also have quotes from the steel industry saying that they're not hearing a clear demand. So there's someone needs to kind of take that first step and say yes. And the platform that Chats is working on is going to help do exactly that. But just looking at the auto industry and where that demand is coming from, as Chats was saying, the auto industry has a lot of climate commitments, and that addresses their whole supply chain. And so in order to meet those commitments, even after transitioning to electric vehicles, there's still somewhere between 20 and 30% of emissions coming from the steel in cars before they even hit the road. And so to get those emissions, they really need to be thinking now about how they're going to procure green steel. And we're seeing this take off in Europe in particular. voestalpine, which is a European steelmaker, has specifically cited the auto industry as a reason why they're investing in green steel. And in the US, just thinking about some of the things that we've seen so far in terms of action from some of the big automotive companies, we've seen GM and Ford both join the First Movers Coalition, which is a 10% near zero emission steel commitment by 2030. And then the CEO of GM, Mary Barra, in their annual general meeting with shareholders, specifically called out supply constraints on green steel as a barrier, but that they were interested in procuring more green steel. So we are hearing demand signals from these key buyers that can help move the market.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to start looking through some of the questions that we have in the chat. That we've had a lot come in, so that's great. Let me just see. There was a question about the 45V tax credit. Could the LCA requirements provided under 45V help address some of the methane leakage concerns Hilary raised regarding production of blue hydrogen in Pennsylvania and elsewhere? I'll open that up to anybody who feels they can answer it.
Well, I can start. So I think, the life cycle emissions assessment that looks at, the life cycle of creating hydrogen. And so I think there's maybe some opportunity there that would address more of the emissions. And I know that that's part of what the Department of Energy is looking at. But I do think that there is some just ingrained hesitancy and resistance to like fracking as a practice in these communities. And so the idea of continuing to rely on methane gas, it's more than just the climate emissions. I think the climate emissions are part of it, but it's, you know, the harm that the fracking industry brings to these communities. And also, as I mentioned, some of the health concerns, which I think are, you know, very real and present in the methane industry, which won't be addressed by the tax credits.
Maybe just to add, I guess, to Hilary's point on the LCA, I mean, it's going to be dictated on the standard, and there's a clean hydrogen production standard that is already, I guess, in motion and sort of published. But looking at the details of what that boundary is, particularly for a natural gas pathway and the methane leakage, and if default emission factors or the level of monitoring and governance that's going to be there, it's just like additional risk essentially of what we're doing. So can be achievable. We can see it today, but it's, you know, how much more cost and economics is the natural gas supply chain willing to invest to make sure that that rate is low, as well as in the additionality of looking at CCS efficiency. And so there is this notion, right, and belief that both pathways can get there, but this reliance on having methane intensity incredibly low, less than the average now, and high capture is what we have modeled to see competitiveness and, you know, comparability with green, you know, sort of pathways or that bound.
We have a question about biochar production. As the person wants to know if biochar production that yields syngas can fit into decarbonizing steel, cement, and chemicals. Is that a topic any of you are familiar with?
I think if it can get to syngas, then it can play a role. I am not familiar with the details of biochar per se, but syngas is a building block into this.
Do you mind elaborating what syngas is, kind of the role that it plays, and particularly these heavy industries?
Yeah, I think it's something where if you don't have to start off with fossil fuels, and you're using kind of a low carbon route to get there, then it can play a role as a kind of building block to many of the things that we're trying to do here. So like I mentioned, I'm not familiar with biochar as the technology, but syngas itself does play a role in many of the work that we're trying to do here with chemicals refining and industrial decarb.
One question we have is about the role of carbon offsets or carbon credits. Obviously, there's been concerns raised and issues around kind of sort of existing mechanisms, but this person wants to know if there's a role for offsets and credits to play if they're enacted properly. For example, credits associated with direct air capture. And I'll open that up to anyone.
I mean, I think we get asked this question a lot about carbon credits. And what you'll notice in the liftoff reports is that we're very careful. These are not policy reports, but it's more what do you have to believe to get there. And so there's kind of like two routes to this, either if a technology is more expensive or is a cost, then consumers are willing to absorb that. If not, then there needs to be kind of a market for these things. And so, it's kind of like two different pathways to try to achieve the same thing. So, carbon credits can, play a role in activating things, but I think it's, one of the levers that one can think about, but not the only one in order to drive these things out.
Another question we have is again related to hydrogen. For low carbon hydrogen to get to scale and volume needed for green steel, so direct reduced iron with electric arc furnaces, do we foresee first addressing existing gray hydrogen demand mainly from fertilizer production?
Like in terms of, I guess, the order of operation of hydrogen use, I think most folks are probably familiar with, concepts of the hydrogen ladder and looking at economics and, I guess, this technology readiness, adoption readiness as well. Places where gray hydrogen is used today, so in fertilizer and refineries, I'd say the fundamental infrastructure is already in place for that transition. Then you have to look at, I guess, the economics of why they're using grey hydrogen already existing. Vanessa already touched on, I guess, the chemicals and refining sector and the interplay of that. And so transitioning out of grey and for, I guess, green or a lower carbon footprint hydrogen base there will have to be, on a project economics level, but it makes sense because they're using it already. For steel making, it's quite interesting, and Hilary mentioned this on the direct reduction path where natural gas is already used. The way that the process actually works is splitting off, and there's a CO and a hydrogen, and that's what does the process. So inevitably there's a level of almost like hydrogen usage that is going on today with the natural gas. And so again, it comes back to perhaps not proving out that the technology works to get these products, but more so in, making sure that the price competitiveness in the projects, as well as, these community impacts are all kind of, tied together.
I would just add to that majority of the contracting of green hydrogen currently is actually from those traditional grey hydrogen demand sectors, so ammonia and kind of refineries. So not that much. We haven't seen that much kind of green hydrogen contracting for steel or cement sectors.
And Selene, I had a follow-up question for you, kind of given that you're, based in the UK. If you could give us a sense of what the policies or market forces are for driving industrial decarbonization in Europe or beyond even.
Yeah, sure. So obviously in Europe, in UK and wider Europe, we've got a carbon price, right? So all industrial facilities are covered by EU ETS, European Emissions Trading System, which is a cap and trade system, and operates on the basis that each industrial facility is allocated a certain amount of free credits, and then should they exceed those allowances, they have to buy credits from the open market. And typically, the kind of inflection point for switching away from fossil fuels, the expectation is that the carbon price has to be around 100 euros, $100. So we are currently at around 80, 90 euros. So getting quite close to it. So that's a direct, obviously, incentive to kind of for these industrial facilities to decarbonize. And also, obviously, we've got the CBAM, that is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which basically levies a cost on imported dirty steel and dirty cement, and that's obviously to kind of protect the European steel industry, clean steel industry from having dirty steel dumped into Europe and kind of blocking that competitiveness. So in answer to your question, the EU ETS and obviously UK equivalent is a huge driver for decarbonization, probably the biggest driver.
And Vanessa, we have a question from the audience. It says, is DOE interacting with the Mission Possible Partnership, which focuses on carbon reduction of these three industries? And then I know you had wanted to mention the Clean Energy Corps, so also feel free to mention that as well.
Perfect. Yes, we are very close to the Mission Possible Partnership. In fact, they were with us at Deploy 23 and helped us organize a roundtable with many of the chemicals folks around this. And so I think the good news about the ecosystem is we're all working with each other. And so it's hard to find someone who isn't working with everyone else in this. And so, yes, we are close to that. And thank you, Maria, for the plug on the Clean Energy Corps. We are actively recruiting people here at the Department of Energy to join forces with us to actually help drive a lot of the work that is being done at the Department of Energy to really catalyze the energy transition, the clean energy transition, because this is a historic time for Department of Energy. There's many folks like myself, David Crane, Jigar Shah, and others who come from the private sector. And this has been very powerful because it has allowed us to really focus on that private-led, government-enabled mantra that we have, because many of us understand how the private sector thinks, how they make decisions, and so forth. So if any of you are looking to make a big difference in the federal government, please apply to the Clean Energy Corps. We're looking for fantastic people. And based on the Q&A activity, I think all of you guys are extremely thoughtful. And it's a shame we don't have more time to cover much of the Q&A. But these are the kinds of hard questions that we ourselves are asking over here. And so if you're interested to help us solve those, please join the Clean Energy Corps.
Great, thank you. And with that, I think we will wrap up the panel. I really appreciate all of you panelists for sharing your expertise, and for the audience for listening, and for everyone for bearing with us with our technical issues. I also just wanted to mention Canary Media is a nonprofit newsroom. We keep all of our coverage paywall free, but if you want to support us financially, you can do so on our website. And thank you again, everybody, for your time.